Hello, I'm Kenny Hines, author of A Global History of Blacks in the 19th Century, and today I'm going to help you understand the significance of Juneteenth. As you may know, Juneteenth is now a federal holiday, and it commemorates the end of chattel slavery in the United States. By chattel slavery, I mean Blacks being used as property, considered property. Chattel, closely related to the word cattle, denotes property. June 19th uh, actually is a combination, Juneteenth is a combination of the words June and 19. Now, over the years, the holiday has grown to symbolize all the dates and times in which Blacks in the United States were freed from enslavement. Now, to help understand Juneteenth and put it in perspective, I'm gonna go over a brief timeline. Now, Civil War begins April 12, 1861. Emancipation Proclamation is issued January 1st, 1863, about 3 months shy of being 2 years. Now, if the Emancipation Proclamation freed all slaves, then the official roll call or the official call for Blacks to join the Army happened in 1863 in February. And the war did not end until 1865, about a little over 2 years after Black soldiers went into and joined the military. So if the emancipation freed the slaves, as most people think, why would the war go on for another 2 years? The last land battle was fought in Texas on May the 12th in 1865. And this is a month after the war ended. And this is a month before Blacks in Texas received word that slavery had indeed ended. Now, the end of the Civil War is what ended slavery. It wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation. The 13th Amendment officially ended slavery, and there were slaves, even after Juneteenth, there were still slaves in the United States up until the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Now, both sides in the Civil War initially skirted around the issue of the war. In the South, the Confederacy was saying they were fighting this war to maintain states' rights, and that states' rights trumped federal law. And in the North, they said we're fighting to save the Union. You know, they didn't acknowledge the true reason was to end chattel slavery. But if you go to Washington, D.C., and you look up at the Lincoln Memorial, you'll see that he is acknowledged for saving the Union, not for freeing slaves. Actually, Lincoln showed his stance on slavery, and in a open-faced letter to the editor of the New York Tribune, and what he said is, that was Horace Greeley, and what he said is, my paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or destroy slavery. So when we call Lincoln the great emancipator, we are mistaken. Now, one of my biggest problems with the Emancipation Proclamation is that most people think that it took 2.5 years for the news of the Emancipation Proclamation to reach the slaves in Texas. And most people think that people in Texas were a little stupid because they remained free from slavery. They remained enslaved 2.5 years longer than everybody else. That's not the truth. Initially, there was a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation that came out 3 months before the original, or before the Emancipation Proclamation. And what it did is it just basically told everyone that in 3 months, all the slaves are going to be free in the South, in the states that are in rebellion against the United States, okay? In reality, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free any slaves. Lincoln proclaimed it to be a war measure. He was trying to demoralize the troops in the South, the Confederate troops. It was also an executive order, meaning that the next president after Lincoln could have reversed it. And even if it was a legitimate, if it had legitimately freed slaves, it could have been reversed by the next president. Now, it didn't apply to the slaves in the border states. And these were states that were part of the Union that also had slaves. And in the South, which was the Confederacy, they didn't recognize the Emancipation Proclamation. They saw it as, they saw themselves as a sovereign nation, and they said Lincoln had no authority to free slaves there. So they didn't tell their slaves that they were free. As a matter of fact, I toured about 20 years ago a plantation in southern Louisiana, and the tour guide said, the Emancipation Proclamation came, it came and left, and it didn't change a thing on that plantation. Open doors, what it did do is it opened the doors for Black soldiers to fight in the Civil War. Now, let's look at those border states I talked about earlier. At the beginning of the Civil War, there were 4 border states. Halfway through the Civil War in 1863, 39 counties in Virginia broke away and formed the new state of West Virginia, okay? Now, also note that the lowest percentage of slaves held in the border states was about 20%. Contrast that with the slaves in the Confederate states. The lowest percentage there was 25% versus the highest percentage in the border states being 20. Now, South Carolina and Mississippi, which had the highest percentage of slaves, were also the first two, they were also the first 2 states to secede from the Union. Now, about 3.5 million slaves existed in the Confederate States, and there were about 500,000 slaves that lived in the border states. Now, again, the states with the highest percentage, South Carolina and Mississippi, were the first 2 in that order of states to leave the Union. Now let's look at Texas in relationship to the other states. They actually had a small number and small percentage compared to the other Confederate states, even though Texas is so large. Now, at the beginning of the war, there were 182,000 slaves in Texas. By the end of the war, there were 250,000 slaves in Texas. Now, these figures here are from the 1860 census. Now, the reason that there were so many more slaves at the end of the war is a lot of slave holders took their slaves to Texas. Couple good reasons. One, there wasn't much fighting going on in Texas. And 2, some of these slave masters didn't want to fight the war themselves. Now, everything in Juneteenth centers around General Gordon Granger coming to Galveston on June 19, 1865. He came in by boat across the Gulf of Mexico, and he arrives in Galveston and he places the entire state under military control. It becomes one of the 5 military districts. He meets up with 2,000 Black soldiers that have already been sent there, and he issues Field Order Number 3. He first goes to the Osterman building and reads it, and this is where the Union soldiers have their headquarters. He then goes to the county or the state house, the courthouse, I should say, and he proclaims slavery ending in Texas. And then the final places he goes to is a place called Negro Church, which is now Reedy AME Church. He goes there and he proclaims the slavery is ended. And he then leads 9 regiments of US troops who spread out and spend the next 6 weeks traveling throughout Texas, informing former slaves of their freedom. Now, if you look at this topographical map, on the left-hand side, you see the green area is where most of the slaves were held. And that's because that's where most of the farming took place. If you look down at the bottom, you'll see a copy of his handwriting at the top of his handwritten fill order number 3. Now I'm not gonna read the whole fill order, but I give you 3 things that are important. Number 1, all slaves are free. He let them know that. He also let them know that they're advised to stay at their present work locations, the present plantations they were working on, and now work for wages, and that the relationship between slave master and slave is ended, and now there's a new relationship of employer and hired labor. And the last thing he mentioned to them is that they wouldn't be supported in the idleness, that they need to work, but in reality, most of the slaves just left. They left after they found out they were free. They left Galveston. Now, to put Juneteenth in further perspective, it's a second timeline that looks at a lot of the different emancipation days that existed in the United States. A lot of people who were from the Caribbean, and the British had 19 different Caribbean islands, received their freedom between August 1st and August 4th. For example, Barbados, they celebrate Emancipation Day on August the 1st, whereas Jamaica celebrates it on August the 2nd. Now, when I was growing up in Detroit, I lived across the river from Canada, and they celebrated Emancipation Day on the 1st. Now, even though the British Emancipation Day started, is recorded on 1834, they had expected the slaves and tried to get the slaves to work for 4 more years under a system called apprenticeship, and basically be free labor for free, but that didn't work out too well. Okay, now there are also Black people in the United States that who were raised or grew up on the islands of St. Croix, St. John, and St. Thomas, and they celebrate Emancipation Day on July 3rd. And they were freed in 1848. The United States did not buy the Virgin Islands until 1917. And many of the people who live there today and who live in the United States are from St. Croix celebrate Emancipation on June the 3rd. In Washington, D.C., it's April 16th, and that's because on that date in 1862, some 3,000 slaves were freed, and a lot of the politicians and the government workers there who owned slaves compensated themselves. They freed the slaves. They had appropriated over $1 million to free the slaves in Texas. I'm sorry, the slaves in Washington, D.C. Now, Watch Night started in the North. And on January the 1st, 1863, they were expecting all of the slaves to be freed in the South based on what they had heard in the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And on December 31st, 1862, they went to the churches and they prayed for their relatives and folks that they knew in the South to be freed on January 1st. Now, as we know, that didn't really happen, but they would celebrate or not celebrate, I'm sorry. They would go to the church each year and pray. And then after blacks were freed 2 years later, then they would go keep that tradition. They kept that tradition up and would go to the church and actually give thanks for the freedom. In Eastern Tennessee, Andrew Johnson, who had been or who would in the future become the president after Lincoln was assassinated, he was a slaveholder, but he was pro-union, and he freed his slaves in Eastern Tennessee on August the 8th, 1863, as did other slaveholders in that region. And that day began, August the 8th is a day that is sometimes, I think in some areas, is still celebrated in Tennessee as the Emancipation Day. Now, recently I read an article where Florida had an Emancipation Day of May 20th, and much like General Granger for Texas, General Andrew Alexander Cook, he went to Tallahassee, Florida, and proclaimed all slaves in the state to be free. And that was, again, 1865, about a month after the Emancipation Proclamation said that all the slaves, well, after a month after the Civil War ended, my bad. So now, the last state is Delaware and Kentucky. They did not free their slaves until the 13th Amendment was ratified. And it was ratified on December the 6th, 1865. But it was about 12 days later that they actually got, slaves were actually freed after getting the word of it. So Juneteenth, what it does is it capsulizes and symbolizes all these dates into one day. Now, let's look at how Juneteenth evolved through the years. It was the person, and Reverend Jack Yates, who led the effort to have a holiday or a celebration, at least, not a holiday, but a celebration for Juneteenth. He along with Elias Dibble, who was the pastor of Trinity Methodist Church, and Jack Yates, who was the pastor of Antioch Missionary Baptist Church. They, along with their congregations and two other people, Richard Brock and Richard Allen, those two, along with Jack Yates and Reverend Dibble, raised $800, and about 7 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, 7 years after the Civil War, they created Emancipation Park in Houston, Texas. And they also formed the Colored People's Festival and Emancipation Park Association. And every year they would go to Emancipation Park and celebrate Juneteenth, close up the park. And once again, a year later, they would come and celebrate it. Now that park is still in existence today. Emancipation Park in Houston, Texas. If you look at the black and white picture, you can see how it looked when I arrived in Houston in 1981. It's the oldest city park in Houston. This year it celebrates 150 years. It was initially only used for Juneteenth and became a city park in 1918 when help was needed to keep the park up. In the past decade, it received a $33 million grant, and it's been totally updated. You can see in the color picture, new facilities, new sports facilities, administration facilities, swimming pool. There has been a lot of renovations to the park. And so it's still open. And the only other Emancipation Park that I know of is one in Kingston, Jamaica. Now, moving on along, let's look at some of the individuals, modern day individuals who are responsible for keeping Juneteenth alive. In 1967, C. Anderson Davis, who worked for the NAACP, came to Houston to shore up that office, to fill office, and he was the chief visionary behind the present day revival of Juneteenth. And what he envisioned was a day that that we could reflect on the past as well as celebrate in the present. And he fought for the revival of Juneteenth. He actually wrote a proclamation that later became House Bill 1016, helping to make Juneteenth a state holiday. Now, if he was the architect, Al Edwards was a salesperson. He was a person, was a state representative representing the Houston area. And he introduced House Bill 1016 in 1998 as a freshman legislator. And he introduced word for word what had been produced by C. Anderson Davis. Okay, so now moving on along, he faced heavy opposition, but as a salesperson, he was able to garner support. He basically told some of the Dixiecrats, look, if you support my legislation, I'll support yours. And he was able to persuade them to support it. So in 1980, Juneteenth became a state holiday in Texas, and which made Texas the first state to establish a state holiday commemorating the end of slavery in the United States. Now, by 2020, 40 years later, 47 states and Washington, D.C. Begin to recognize Juneteenth as a state holiday. Now, the person who had the vision of Juneteenth being a national holiday was Oprah Lee. She's 95 years old. She's a civil rights leader and advocate, activist, I should say. And she was a longtime proponent of Juneteenth being a national holiday. In fact, she led the effort for it to become a national holiday. And she initiated that movement over 40 years ago. And to back up her beliefs, she walked 1,400 miles from Washington, D.C. to Fort Worth, Texas in 2016. And in the process, she collected more than 1.6 million petitions for Juneteenth to become a national holiday. Incidentally, her family in Marshall, Texas, her family home was burned to the ground on Juneteenth in 1939 when she was just a 10-year-old child. Now, the person that brought it on home was Sheila Jackson Lee, who was a U.S. Congresswoman representing the 18th District, where Houston is in which Houston is a part of. She led the fight in Congress to have Juneteenth recognized as a federal holiday. She shored up the votes in the Senate through Senator John Cornyn of Texas. She sponsored the same Juneteenth bill in Congress for 12 consecutive years before she was able to get it. And now, as Speaker Pro Tem, she presided over the House as the votes were counted on June 16, 2021. And here's a little clip of that.
On this vote, the yeas are 415 and the nays are 14. The bill is passed.
And with the passage of the bill, or the Juneteenth Independence Day Act, as it was called, it was signed into law the next day by Joe Biden, making Juneteenth a national holiday. Now, let's take a look at Juneteenth and how it's evolved through the years. Originally, there were a lot of picnics. If you look at, these people are in Austin, Texas in 1900. And if you look closely, you'll see horses and wagon wheels, and you see these people dressed up in their Sunday go-to-meeting clothes and So there were spiritual, religious services, speeches, educational programs about the emancipation and history of Blacks in this country. But today it has evolved to a lot of parades, but there's still some celebrations in churches and in barbecues, cookouts. But let's look at the Juneteenth now. If you look at this picture right here, you can see that in the color shots, this is in Harlem, in Harlem, New York. If you look up in the center, you'll see Apollo Theater, and this is in 2018. This is a parade. Here is 19 Houston, Texas, 1900. You can see Jack Yates's picture. He's on the left-hand side, on the far left, and this is a celebration in Emancipation Park. Here's a celebration in Brooklyn, New York in 2009. Another celebration in Phoenix, Arizona in 1982. Here's one in Milwaukee in 2019. And here's one in Philadelphia in 2020. Now, a few takeaways from this presentation that I want you to understand. First of all, Juneteenth commemorates the end of slavery. Remember that if someone asks you what is the importance of Juneteenth, significance, it commemorates the end of slavery, chattel slavery in the United States. Also, it symbolizes all the freedom dates in which Blacks were emancipated in the United States. Now, President Lincoln did not end slavery. You know, a lot of people want to hang on to that. Slavery was ended while Lincoln was president, but he did not, it wasn't his effort alone that freed slavery, freed the slaves. Texas was not the last state to end slavery. That was Connecticut. Got that one wrong. That was Delaware. And finally, as African Americans left Texas, they carried Juneteenth with them. Now, one last thing, Juneteenth was covered in my book, A Global History of Blacks in the 19th Century, with over 1,200 different historical facts about Blacks from 1800 to 1899, facts about Blacks throughout the world. I promise you this, this book will alter your worldview of history and the roles that Black men and women played in shaping it. It's a textbook, it's a resource book, textbook for school, resource and reference books for libraries, a world history book for your home. You can obtain a autographed copy from my website, educateanduplift.com, and it's also available on the internet. Thank you.